All right, our next presenter for our Reveg session is John Whittingham. John has been involved in mine reclamation and wetland restoration projects for over 30 years. He has a bachelor in geology and geography from the University of Montana and a master's in earth science from MSU. Basic Biological Services has been providing consultation and environmental field services in vegetation management from Dillon, Montana since 1999. John is a licensed and certified commercial herbicide applicator with the Montana Department of Agriculture. He's a certified professional in erosion and sediment control and a professional wetland scientist. John is a member of the International Erosion Control Association. He's a Montana representative for that. And the Society of Wetland Scientists, National Association of Wetland Managers, and North American Invasive Species Management Association. His talk is regarding the use of herbicides and seed mix design in successful revegetation strategy.
Thanks, Steve.
Welcome, John.
Thank you, and appreciate the warm welcome, Steve. Very much thanks to you and all our sponsors. Just to give you a little background on how we started to employ herbicides in our revegetation strategies. Back in the 90s, we recognized that there was a lot of failures that were unexplainable to the operators or the owners, why we were having such a widespread lack of success in germination and establishment of vegetation, and thus leading to erosion and sediment and contamination of the adjacent streams. This might dovetail in well with Mr. Beaver's discussion as we explore some of the properties of herbicides and look at the regulatory regime that we're in now for seed mix design. We see that there's some shortcomings to what we're now obligated to do, and there are some restrictions on what used to be kind of a science and art of revegetation that may be counterproductive to our objectives. So I'll kind of walk you through some of the decision making, but you know, where I do most of my work in Colorado and Montana, both states have a Weed Control Act, and it is unlawful to allow the propagation of state-listed noxious weed species. Well, there's a whole lot of those, and I defy anybody or challenge them to identify all 116 species, especially in their 3 or 4 different growth stages. The same kind of regulatory environment exists in Montana. It's unlawful to propagate noxious weed species. We're lucky we have only got about 41, and there is what we call watch list as well. And so the watch list requires that the owner-operator be aware of the presence of undesirable species, but not necessarily take immediate action with treatment. We also, in both states, are required by law to revegetate our disturbances. So there's a fairly rigorous standard, 70%, and most of my DEQ colleagues suggest that this should be achieved within 3 to 4 years. The sleep, creep, and leap adage is well applied, but we have regulators that have expectations that we successfully revegetate. Well, I'll show you why there's some contradictions here. But first of all, let's get this out of the way. There are a ton of noxious weed species that we need to be aware of on our job sites. And I'll focus on spotted knapweed because that's one of my least favorite species that we encounter most frequently in Montana. Lacey and Marlowe have clearly demonstrated that soil erosion under a spotted knapweed canopy is, on average, 200% greater than under a bunchgrass canopy. So we need to recognize that some of these species are particularly detrimental to our objectives. One of our recent projects, we have our 70% ground cover, a watch list species that does not require immediate action or consideration of use of herbicides. This is the black henbane and a type of mustard. So I pose the question, is this successful revegetation? A nuisance weed and a watch list species, 70% cover. We've got some protection of soil loss from rain splash erosion, but I would contend that this does not constitute a successful revegetation objective. Let's move on to a much more tenacious species. Spotted knapweed, it is allelopathic. It does exude a toxin that kills most other vegetations, whether they be herbaceous or grasses. We had a fish ladder structure replaced here. From that, within about 12 years, this infestation of spotted knapweed emanated from the construction site. Here is a monoculture adjacent to the slide on the left. You can see that the allelopathic characteristics are well displayed here, and now we're going to have a heck of a time with a plant species that has a seed life of 10 to 15 years. So you're looking at a really big challenge when you're dealing with something that's already gone too far. Okay, so we need to keep our heads up and take this issue seriously. And Montana is particularly heavily infested with spotted knapweed. So I'll pick on knapweed a little bit more, but this is, as of 2023, the extent of knapweed in North America. There are approximately 6 to 7 million acres of spotted knapweed in Montana alone, and the economic cost is in the hundreds of millions of dollars, primarily on its effect in agriculture. While I live in Dillon, agriculture is still a big deal, and this is part of why I've become very aware of the significance of the challenges in revegetation. One of our other largest biological challenges in the revegetation arena on the scale of North America, we're really talking many tens of millions of acres that have been infested with cheatgrass. So you have native range, and this is over in the Ennis area, and within about 20 years, this has been the effect of the cheatgrass infestation. Shallow-rooted species, it alters the soil chemistry to its own benefit. It increases your fire frequency on the site. And so a monumental challenge by any measure in terms of its effect on the vegetative communities in North America. Tens of millions of acres in Utah, Idaho, Montana. And what are we going to do about this? You can't really expect to use herbicides on this scale. Okay, so prevention is really our best option if we recognize the challenge. Just an idea of what we're dealing with. I question this literature, 56 million acres of cheatgrass. We've seen through numerous studies that the knapweeds easily spread at 20 to 25%, easily on an average rate. In Montana alone, there's plenty of good documentation that the average rate of spread of knapweed is 27%. So this is a species that not only is allelopathic, it kills the existing vegetation, it has a 10 to 15 year seed life in the soil. We need to be aware of it. So I think I've demonstrated the case where in our efforts to revegetate successfully or even maintain our existing vegetative community, we have to at least consider the use of herbicides. And so when we, as managers and decision makers on your properties and your reclamation efforts, what is it that the practitioner needs to consider? Well, excuse me. So you've got, the basics are pre-emergent. You use a product that is applied before the vegetation is emerged from the above ground environment, and post-emergent. Okay, so after the vegetation is displayed itself. We have non-selective and selective herbicides. So what confuses many people is, modern chemistries, they're very effective at targeting individual species and life forms. So we can use selective herbicides effectively on forbs, most commonly, with having hopefully minimal impact on grasses, for example. Now, what we've seen in the news within the last 10 or 15 years, the non-selective products that kill all life forms are commonly mistaken for a product that has the selectivity and the focus that we need to attack this problem. Sterilants are another class of herbicides that are long-term and we really won't talk about them. But these are products that have been around, for example, 2,4-D since 1941 and glyphosate from 1950. So there's a lot of controversy about glyphosate in particular and how it affects the soil biota, and does it leave us with hot spots or not. So we'll talk about that here real quickly, because we're going to look at some of the characteristics of these products. The other challenge is, systemic products, they translocate through the plant body. They perform well with foliar contact or absorption through the roots. They have soil activity. So they not only are absorbed through the foliage, but they're absorbed through the root system. Generally superior control. But then we have contact herbicides, which you may hear the term burn down. They're highly effective on the above ground foliage, little or no soil activity, and generally short-term in control. So this is kind of a little decision tree. What type of product are we looking for? And then we get into what is now more commonly controversial is synthetic products, which is most of what we have at our disposal. They're generally highly regulated, 10 to 15 years of testing before they go on the market. The vast majority of the herbicide products are acids, and specifically carboxylic acids. So we're dealing with mild acids. And so I'm going to try to diffuse some of the fear associated with using or considering a tool like herbicides. They can be selective or non-selective, pre or post-emergent, persistent or not, but their performance has been well proven through countless research publications. We really know what we're getting into when we're considering some of these synthetic products. Well, I tried to find a definition of an organic herbicidal product, and that to me was one of the common definitions, but particularly confusing. A chemical that's naturally occurring in nature. Okay, so we're making acids, we're deriving acids from naturally occurring products, but what we'll find is that some of the organic products that are currently on the market are not regulated by our federal laws or agencies. There is an organic program that does oversee some of the use of these products, but by and large, we're back to carboxylic acids, citric acid, acetic acid. I've used a lot of D-limonene with different effects. And then just for fun, I threw out, here's some of the names of the organic products. And as a practitioner, I'm like, well, how would I distinguish with a chemical name like that from a synthetically derived product? I think the bottom line is that we're looking at something that's been minimally regulated versus something that is extensively regulated. All right, we'll just kind of flash through this. You have signal words, you have toxicity categories that the EPA insists that we understand. We need to distinguish a poison from a carcinogen, from a mutagen, from a teratogen. So all of these are poisons. And I'll demonstrate through some literature that the EPA has derived on just how poisonous they are. None of these, at least according to our EPA, are carcinogens. Now that, of course, is controversial. We won't even go into the mutagenic and teratogenic effects. And basically, you need to wear your proper protective equipment. So in terms of understanding the label, this is a ureic acid product. It's a dry flowable. It's very useful because of its targeting specific plant families. But just an example of a label. One thing that we have to pay particular attention to is you buy a product and somebody down at the hardware store says, hey, use this, products, XBZ. And you're like, well, okay, great. But is the species of concern on the product label? So that's really critical when you're selecting a product or you're picking an applicator to manage your mine site. Is he aware of the species that we're trying to target? So this is a common element of your product label. There's a body of literature out there, and I'll refer to Dr. Rice from U of M in Missoula, that explains to us at least some of the results that they have found in use of an aminopyrrolid, which is a very common herbicide of modern era. It's a carboxylic acid. We'll demonstrate here in a moment just how dangerous it is to the applicator or the environment. But if you're using lupin, for example, in your seed mix, you'll find that they're very tolerant to the amino acids. But if you have some of these other species, white prairie clover, those species are very sensitive to the amino acid product. So when you're designing your seed mix, you need to at least recognize that there is a body of literature out there that can lead you in the right direction so that you're not destroying the vegetation that you're attempting to establish. And the same is true for shrubs. So we find nowadays we got a lot of sagebrush in our seed mixes, very tolerant to the aminopyralids, the carboxylic acid. And so that information is available to us. Should we decide to spend $10,000 on a seed mix and then another $20,000 or $30,000 on an application that we think is appropriate, and then we find out that a large component of our seed mix is very sensitive to the herbicides that the other contractor is using. So this kind of just may explain why we've got hot spots. And I'll show through other interpretations of these products why they may be particularly long-lived in the soil environment. But as a commercial applicator, I know that there are tendencies for people to over-apply the herbicide. And some of these herbicides are very long-lived, and you have hot spots or dead zones that this may be one of the reasons why we're seeing inconsistent results. But when we're in a revegetation regimen, we're spraying spring and fall. When we're in a seeding regimen, we're seeding spring and fall. We've got replant intervals. Now, what's the chances that your seed contractor is also your herbicide contractor? Well, that's what I do, is both. But I need to, when I'm working on a regimen of revegetation, I need to realize that some of the species that I'm most wanting to establish, like western wheatgrass in this part of the world, I can't apply the seed until 2 to 3 months after I've used that herbicide because of its residuum. Well, you got to schedule this. So not only do you schedule it spatially, but temporally. So you need to know where you've been putting the herbicides, what time of the year you're going to reapply your seed, and this will help you in scheduling that process. All right, well, we've got a new project just south of Fairmont here, and we're going to disturb about 130 acres. We're now salvaging soil. We're going to use cover crops for the topsoil stockpiles. But all of the decision-making has been done last winter in terms of what seed species, what's our regimen for herbicide application. We're going to use a cover crop on the topsoil stockpiles, or we're going to reseed the disturbance after with a specified seed mix. And these are just examples. This literature is available to you, and something as simple as fire resistance, which is now a big deal. So when I'm reclaiming industrial plant and it's got a rail line system going through it, and the old seed mix from the 1980s says, let's use pubescent wheatgrass or intermediate wheatgrass, which is hay, up against the rail line, we've got to look at those from a different perspective now, given that we've got greater concerns about wildfire. You've got great resources, Granite Seed, I'm not endorsing them, but they can explain to you some of the traits of the individual seed. Give you an idea in layperson's terms what the characteristics of those species are. This is an old seed mix, which kind of give you an idea of how simple it was years ago. This is Graymont. And then a more recent seed mix, which a little more complex, a little more variety with the forbs in particular. But now we're under a new paradigm, sage grouse. And so my borrow pit that we're starting, I didn't really have the prerogative to design a seed mix based on the inventory of the existing species. This has been dictated to me as a seed mix designer based on whether or not I'm in core habitat or, non-core habitat or core habitat. So I inherit this new seed mix, and I have a very little latitude on changing it without going through a review process from MDEQ, and this may or may not resemble what's on my site. So we're under kind of a new regulatory paradigm. But now if we've demonstrated that we've got to control weeds, and herbicides are a useful tool, and we have seed mix design, some of which we inherit, some of which we actually use our creativity and our scientific understanding, we've got to recognize that there's going to be human beings using these products. And so the EPA has provided to us toxicity categories, from poisonous to caution, and even practically non-toxic. So all of the herbicides that we're currently using are in this category 3 and 4. The insecticides from the 1940s are in the category 1, and they're labeled appropriately because they truly were dangerous to human beings and the environment. Organophosphates, for example. All right. Basically, category 4. That's a heck of a lot of dosage. That's piles of herbicide, and you're not going to die from acute oral toxicity with these category 4 herbicides. Probably need to move on, but just know that these are well-known and well-established thresholds in terms of toxicity to your employees, your contractors. You know what you're asking them to expose themselves to. You know what kind of PPE they should be wearing and what they are wearing. And you hopefully take the time to ensure that your employees and your contractors are adequately protected. But I thought, just for fun, and this really gets people going, one of our most popular products is an amino pyrrolide. It's carboxylic acid, just like aspirin, just like caffeine. Very, very large dosage for oral toxicity, your LD50. Escort, we mentioned earlier, another extremely useful herbicide, and glyphosate, which is Roundup. This is what's causing all the controversy. But then you look at some of your household products. Nicotine. Maybe you've heard of the controversy with neonicotinoids. Okay, these are the most effective insecticides on the planet. They are extremely lethal to even hard-shelled bugs like cockroaches and such. They're using nicotine, and synthetically derived nicotine. So think about that when your kids are starting to chew or whatever they do. This stuff is bad for you. Okay, you think herbicides are bad? Look at some of the products that are on the market that are minimally regulated. I'm guessing there's a lot of caffeine use in our community, in our society. I like my coffee, but a palmful of pure caffeine is lethal. It's category 2 toxin. We luckily enjoy a product that's very diluted, and the acidity of the product is part of what gives us the effect. And the same is true here for aspirin. You ingest a bottle of aspirin, you're toast, and it'd be a gruesome death. Bleed out from the inside. Pretty high toxicity, category 2. How am I doing for time? Oh shoot, I'm sorry. I'm really getting a little carried away here. But, we look at toxicity to aquatic organisms. The half-life is really the attribute of the herbicide that's most relevant in terms of threat to the environment. When you're using herbicides, they all have this very well-documented rain fastness. So if it's on the plant for an hour and you get a 1/4 inch of rain, you're still going to have that systemic effect. It's on the label. They'll tell you exactly what the characteristics of the product are. Your VOCs, if you're spraying weeds right next to the manager's office and he's downwind, he's going to be upset. He'll smell it. You're potentially affecting him. So keep in mind the volatility. Really need to kind of crank through this. This is a bunch of gobbledygook, but it's out there and it's very accessible. If you chose to get into a revegetation program, the characteristics are well documented, your toxicities, your solubilities. The absorptivity in soil is probably the most significant driving factor in contaminating adjacent waters. Those products that adhere to the clay versus those that don't. If they're highly soluble and they don't adhere to clay, then they move on into the aquatic environment. But we know what we're getting into. We don't have to walk blindly into this game. And the half-life is another driver of your potential effects to the aquatic environment. Very long-lived chemicals. We don't use paraquat in this country very often or anymore. Pechloram or Tordon was notorious because of its half-life. It wasn't so toxic. It just was in the environment for years. And it inhibited vegetation growth, thus the hot spots, perhaps. Probably better move on, because this is basically the same information. I wanted to touch on a few of these individual products, but you get the idea. It's well-documented information. We know what we're getting into. And should you decide to want to take this a little further, we have, for example, WinPest, Windows pesticide screening tool. That model, which is public domain software and required by many of our agencies, including the NRCS, it incorporates all those physical properties of the herbicides and the characteristics of the environment that we're putting the herbicides in terms of soil texture, clay content. And clay content, it really is what affects your pesticide mobility the greatest. But we have this information available to us in a very user-friendly black box type of model, should you need to verify the characteristics. So some of the fun stuff. And I'm a field practitioner, and a lot of what we do is field services. Mowing's a great option. Here we're providing some perimeter control. We're going to hit some of the heavily infested areas in one of our wetland restoration projects. We also deal with industrial sites. A lot of fun, a lot of variety. Test plots, cut and sprayed versus just sprayed. You've got to do your long-term monitoring to demonstrate to your client that this significant investment is worth their time and money. And long-term monitoring, great revegetation with an extremely expensive seed mix and a wetland restoration. We got to identify where our problem areas are, photo document our success. We advocate eradicating or amending the weed populations prior to salvaging topsoil. Don't forget that. So if you're going to use a sod mat replacement in your wetland restoration, you dig up a couple hundred cubic yards of Canada thistle and you put those sod mats on your new stream bank. Thistle is stimulated by disturbance. So get out there, select a product that you're comfortable with, and maybe reduce the weed population before you salvage your topsoil and then spread it all over your reclamation site. So, but it does happen. And that's how we got in the game. It was like, well, how come these revegetation efforts are not working? Why do we have such widespread problems? Some of it is fun, but you got to have the right people. And you got to take care of them, let them know that you're protecting their interests. We get in a lot of different environments. Our business caters a lot to the wetland restoration work and mine reclamation efforts. And then we follow up in a scheduled manner with the seeding. Now, we're not ag producers, so we don't seed in a conventional way. It's very localized. But, we've got exploration sites with spur roads that you need to amend. The compaction is another explanation for the hot spots where you've got a lack of vegetation. Use of soil amendments and mulches. It's a great science. It's a lot of fun to try to demonstrate to yourself and others what's working and what isn't. And I do a lot of work with small properties for ag production, spring and fall seeding. It's great fun. Test plots with soil amendments, interesting environments to work in. There are risks, obviously steep slopes, areas of entrapment if you go into a tailings pond. And I want to thank you very much. That's the boss, owner of our company, and one of our job sites. So it doesn't get much better than this. Thanks, folks.
Thanks, John. We've got time for a few questions. If no further questions.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. We appreciate it.